The third research question is whether royal patronages help, whether they have any effect. And this is much more complicated. The research that we had done up until this point is basically counting. So it's counting numbers of patronages or number of patronages in a certain region or sector or whatever. And although it was fiddly, it's basically counting. And now we move to something that is not basically counting at all, because we are trying to get some kind of comparison. We're trying to understand or get some line of sight into what happens to a charity when it gets a royal patronage, which would not have happened if it had not got that patronage. So we're trying to compare what we actually see, the charity with the patronage, with the counterfactual of what would have happened otherwise. Obviously, we can't observe this counterfactual because we don't have a world in which these charities both do get a patronage and also don't get a patronage. So we try to use comparisons which are reasonable and defensible and which give us some line of sight. We did this in three main ways. This is complicated. The first way, or the first set of ways, were to use some econometric regression analyses. Well, actually, the first way that we did it is much simpler to understand, which is that we just plotted the revenue of some charities which are in what we call natural comparator sets. So where the charities are pretty comparable. So for example, the UK has a number of air ambulance charities, and they all do pretty much the same thing, just in different parts of the country. And the UK has many children's hospices, which do basically the same thing in different parts of the country. And there are a few other sets that are comparable like that. And so the first thing that we did was to take, let's say, the air ambulances and to plot their revenue over a 20-year period. We were given a set of data that has charities' financial data back to 1995. And we just plotted the revenue of the air ambulance charities over that whole period, all of them in grey, they're all aligned. And then the ones that get a royal patronage go red at the point that they start. And that enables us to see, just visually, does anything happen to the revenue of charities which have royal patronages, which does not also happen to all the other comparable charities at the same time? And the answer is no. Those graphs are in our report. Charities revenue jumps around a lot, which is because of things like unexpected legacies, or they might have an exhibition that's very successful, or they might just get a donation or a public contract. So all charity revenues just are quite lumpy and bumpy. But you can see that the whole pack kind of moves, and they basically move in a way that's quite independent of each other. But the ones that get royal patronages, nothing happens to them, particularly at the point that they get them or thereafter, which doesn't basically happen to everything else in the pack. They tend to be, within the pack and to remain within the pack. Their revenue doesn't suddenly increase, and neither does it suddenly, increase in gradient, start growing faster. So just with our eyes, and we have those graphs for quite a number of comparator sets. So just with our eyes, it looks as though nothing much is going on. We also, within this first set, as I say, use much more sophisticated analytical techniques. We used a series of two-way fixed effects models to compare charities before and after they got patronages. The two-way fixed effects refers to looking at effects in time that affect all charities at that time, and also effects that are unique to each charity. So, for example, that could cope with the fact, a situation where if a charity had revenue that was rising faster than the pack before the patronage start, you might expect that growth rate to continue after it. And we use a number of dependent variables there, looking at income itself, change in income, change in log income, and so on. And none of those analyses produced reliable answers. None of them produced decent evidence that the patronages were having an effect. We also used a synthetic comparator method, and this is where we're trying to compare a charity, as I said, which gets a patronage, with one that was really similar that did not get a patronage. But because there are lots of factors that affect charities, some of which we can't see, we don't know which charity is identical to the charity that gets a patronage. So we make one. We use an algorithm that goes into the data and it constructs a synthetic comparator whose revenue before the patronage starts tracks, so moves in the same way as the one which then eventually gets a patronage. And we look at what happens after the patronage starts to the one that gets a patronage and also to the one that does not get a patronage. And we ran that a number of times. We ran it for all the instances that we could do. And again, that does not produce reliable answers. So we had there in that first set a battery of examples of analyses looking for the effect of royal patronages on charities' revenue, and we could not find an effect. And as I say, it looks just as though looking with our eyes, as though there doesn't seem to be an effect. I mean, we know that our eyes sometimes are very good and sometimes can deceive us, and the purpose of statistical tests is to help us find things that our eyes can't find, or to ensure that we don't find things that aren't really there. Secondly, we looked in quite a different way on a more macro basis. So we were interested in this argument that some people make that the involvement of the royal family in charities at all has an effect on the way that as a nation that we think about charities and volunteering and charitable activity and the prestige in which charities are held, and that this has an effect on volunteering, and on generosity. And one way that we sought to investigate that was by looking at whether areas which have geographic areas which have more royal patrons also are more generous. So we found data for what's called participation in giving, which is the proportion of people who have donated within the last 4 weeks. And we found those data within English regions, so the proportion of people in the northwest who've given in the last 4 weeks, the proportion of people in the southeast, for example, who've given in the last 4 weeks. So we can see participation in giving by region. And then we can also see the proportion of royal patronages of charities that are in each region. And here, obviously, we're using the English regions as comparators for each other. And we are well aware that this is not a perfect comparison, but as I mentioned, we can't do a perfect comparison. So we're trying multiple routes to try to get a kind of line of sight from each of these methods. We found no correlation. We found no correlation between the proportion of royal patronages that are in each region in England with participation in giving. So it doesn't seem to be the case that having lots of royal patronages makes a region more generous or has any correlation with the generosity of that region. And thirdly, we did a rather analogous analysis looking internationally. So here we looked at nations which have resident royal families, of which there are many: the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, Cambodia, Japan, Lesotho, Morocco, for example. And we looked at generosity as defined by the Charities Aid Foundation, which publishes annually a ranking of charities based on their generosity. And we looked at where the countries which have resident royal families come within that ranking. And we found that actually of countries that have resident royals, the UK is often at the top, but no country with a resident royal family has been in the top 5 in that index in the last few years. And if we take a composite of the last 8 years, so adding together the scores that each country gets, we found that no country with a resident royal family has been in the top few spots in any of the last 8 years. And actually, countries with resident royal families fall in various places throughout the list. And indeed, one of them is almost bottom of the list. The list has 146 countries on it. So in there, we're obviously using countries as comparators, and clearly there are many things that vary between countries and indeed royal families, but we're using them as comparators for each other. And so those data also don't seem to support the notion that royalty of itself makes a country more generous. So that concludes what I wanted to explain about the research, what we did and what we found. The reason that we did this research was to help charities and donors, and to some extent patrons, to make evidence-based decisions, because we believe and we find that evidence-based decisions can make organisations and donors more effective. To our knowledge, nobody had ever looked at these questions about the effectiveness of royal patrons and patronages before, and we have seen charities go to quite some lengths to seek and to attract and retain royal patrons. And so it seemed to us important to understand whether and when that is really worth it. We think that our findings are interesting and they add to what is already known. We don't purport that they are exhaustive, and obviously the pattern may change over time. But like with all our research, we hope that it is interesting and useful and accurate, and we hope that it enables charities and donors and patrons to increase their effectiveness by making more evidence-based decisions. The full research, like all our research, is available on our website at giving-evidence.com. Many thanks.